only thing that matters is winning. 2 days after the 2020 election, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy told me he had talked to Donald Trump. He knows it's over, McCarthy said. Trump just needed some time to process the loss. He needs to go through all the stages of grief, McCarthy added. For Trump, the stages of grief seemed to involve tweeting in all caps. Shortly after 9 a.m. on November 5th, he tweeted, "Stop the count." An hour later, at 10:09 a.m., any vote that came in after Election Day will not be counted. 30 minutes later, Trump retweeted himself, "Stop the count." Shortly after noon, "Stop the fraud." Donald Trump had been told repeatedly by his top campaign advisors, including on Election Day itself, that early returns on election night could show him leading initially, but that those numbers were likely to change as absentee and mail-in votes were counted. This happened in every presidential election. In many states, Election Day votes were counted first, and a larger percentage of Republicans than Democrats voted on Election Day. This was even more likely to be the case in 2020 because Trump had spent months, against the advice of his political advisors, urging Republicans not to cast absentee and mail-in votes and to vote in person on Election Day instead. Donald Trump knew there would be a, quote, red mirage, in which he seemed to be ahead at the outset. He helped create that red mirage. The phenomenon was evidence of major fraud. "We were up by nearly 700,000 votes in Pennsylvania. I won Pennsylvania by a lot, and that gets whittled down," he said in remarks from the White House briefing room on November 5th. "Likewise, in Georgia, I won by a lot, with a lead of getting close to 300,000 votes on election night in Georgia. And by the way, that got whittled down, and now it's getting to be to a point where I'll go from winning by a lot to perhaps being even down a little bit." The same was happening in Michigan and Wisconsin, Trump claimed. "They're trying to steal an election. They're trying to rig an election, and we can't let that happen." Trump's fraud claims also included repeated assertions about nefarious-sounding ballot dumps. He tweeted that his lead in key states started to magically disappear as surprise ballot dumps were counted. Very strange. In another tweet, he said the mail-in ballot dumps were devastating in their percentage and power of destruction. We now know that Trump was aware this claim was false too. Bill Stepien, Trump's campaign manager, told the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol that he had personally informed Trump that periodic release of ballots would occur. Once again, Trump was taking something he knew to be a routine feature of the counting process and making it seem criminal. When McCarthy and I spoke on November 5th, we discussed the fact that although the election had not yet been called for Joe Biden, it seemed likely that would happen soon. When Biden's tally in the Electoral College reached 270, the dynamic would shift, and people would start looking toward the future, the next administration, and the new Congress. McCarthy appeared to be dealing in reality. This made it all the more surprising when I saw his appearance on Fox News just a few hours later. "President Trump won this election," Kevin proclaimed. "So everyone who is listening, do not be quiet, do not be silent about this. We cannot allow this to happen before our very eyes." McCarthy knew that what he was saying was not true. Every candidate has the right to bring legal challenges in court if they have evidence of fraud or irregularities in an election. That's what I expected to happen next. But even as the Trump team was beginning to discuss and file these suits, there were signs that Trump and his supporters might not accept the outcome of any legal challenges. One of the first hints I saw of this came only a couple of days after the election in a tweet by Trump supporter and radio personality Mark Levin. I'd known Mark for many years. He had supported me in the past. During the 2016 primaries, Mark initially supported Ted Cruz. At one point, before Trump's 2016 nomination, Mark had even declared himself never Trump. But all that had changed over the past 4 years. Mark had become an ardent defender of Trump, sometimes signaling what people inside Trump's orbit were thinking. On November 5th, 2020, Levin tweeted this in all caps: "Reminder to the Republican state legislatures, you have the final say over the choosing of electors, not any board of elections, secretary of state, governor, or even court. You have the final say." Article 2 of the federal Constitution. So, get ready to do your constitutional duty. When I saw Levin's tweet, I wondered what exactly he was talking about. The legislatures had already had their final say under Article 2 of our Constitution, which provides that each state legislature directs the manner in which their state appoints presidential electors. Levin surely knew that every state legislature had already done so, and the manner they all chose was a popular vote. Each of the state legislatures had also specified a detailed manner in which to resolve any election disputes, through recounts, audits, and lawsuits if necessary. If a presidential candidate disputes the election in any state by saying it was fraudulent or illegal, and the issue is not resolved by recounts or other procedures, the proper way to proceed under our Constitution is to file a lawsuit. And once that lawsuit is over and the court's judgments are final, the election issues are resolved. Now, however, it seemed that Levin was suggesting the state legislatures should ignore the laws they themselves had passed, specifying the manner in which election disputes would be resolved, ignore the outcome of balloting in their states, and simply switch the results from Biden to Trump. Even conservative law professor John Eastman, who later worked with Donald Trump and would play a major role in January 6th, confided to a colleague before the 2020 election that state legislatures could not change the outcome after the fact. Eastman wrote, "Article 2 says the electors are appointed in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. But I don't think that entitles the legislature to change the rules after the election and appoint a different slate of electors in a manner different than what was in place on Election Day." We were only 2 days past the election, and already Trump and his key supporters were inventing ways to ignore the lawful outcome of that election. Early the next morning, on Friday, November 6th, I texted Adam Kinzinger, a Republican member of Congress from Illinois and an Air Force veteran who had flown missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Adam and I had worked together on national security issues. He was no nonsense and unafraid of speaking out, even in the face of party pressure. As ballot counting continued in key states, the networks had yet to call the election for Biden. I thought it would be called soon, and once that happened, I believed Republicans in Congress would accept the results and move on. However, Levin's tweet and other public statements by Trump and his supporters made me think we needed to be prepared in case attempts were made to pursue paths like the one Levin was suggesting. I asked Adam to help me pull together a list of Republican members we could count on if it became necessary to step forward publicly and put a stop to the nonsense. Kinzinger readily agreed. I had been elected 2 years earlier by my colleagues to serve as chair of the House Republican Conference. The conference chair is the third-ranking Republican in the House, responsible for communications and messaging for the Republican Conference. As chair, I also convened the weekly meetings for all House Republicans. Our weekly meetings, sometimes conducted by phone, normally involved a couple of hundred participants, including Republican members of Congress and congressional staffers, as well as staffers from the White House Office of Legislative Affairs. Occasionally, we would ask guest speakers, including key officials from the Trump administration, to present on a particular topic. Kevin McCarthy sometimes had Trump dialed in, secretly listening to our discussions. Kevin did not inform the entire conference when Trump had joined a call, unless Trump planned to speak. But it wasn't difficult to tell when Trump was listening in. When certain members were particularly lavish in their praise for Trump, I suspected Kevin had alerted them we had a presidential eavesdropper. Our first post-election call of 2020 was at 1 p.m. on Friday, November 6th. Following our opening prayer, we moved into leadership reports, where Kevin, Republican Whip Steve Scalise, and I briefed the membership. Our discussion that day focused on how well House Republicans had performed in races across the country. Though projected to lose seats, we had gained 15, leaving Democrats with a narrow 9-seat majority. After our leadership reports, we opened up the call for questions or comments from other members. Most commended the House Republicans' success on election night, and a number of them described what had happened in their own districts or states. Not a single member of Congress, including those from states Trump was already saying had been stolen from him, suggested that their own election had been rigged or was flawed in any way. There were questions about the process the Trump campaign was likely to pursue going forward, and some discussion of possible audits, recounts, or election-related litigation. After Kevin's appearance on Fox News the night before, I had heard from several colleagues, unhappy that he was echoing Trump's stolen election claims. One member addressed this when it was his turn to speak. There's a legal process for contesting results, and Trump has the right to go through that, he said. But, he warned, we can't have people on TV saying this was rigged when we don't have any evidence of that. McCarthy knew this was a direct criticism of him, and he responded by claiming he hadn't said the election was stolen. His denial was impossible to reconcile with the video of his Fox News appearance. When it was Jim Jordan's turn to speak, the Ohio congressman, perhaps Trump's closest ally in the House, was dismissive of the discussion about the legal process for challenges and recounts. Jordan was not interested in understanding or discussing the rules. He didn't seem to think the rules mattered. The only thing that matters, Jordan said, is winning. As we now know, Trump's own campaign leadership was meeting with him to tell him he was not, in fact, winning. At a meeting on Friday, November 6th, and again on Saturday, November 7th, they informed the president that he had almost certainly lost. Things got weirder over the weekend. On Saturday, former New York City Mayor turned presidential lawyer Rudy Giuliani held a press conference on behalf of the Trump campaign at Four Seasons Total Landscaping, a small business located between a crematorium and an adult bookstore in a strip mall outside Philadelphia. The site was a perplexing choice. Did someone think they were reserving space at the Four Seasons Hotel and end up at the strip mall by mistake? That's what Donald Trump seemed to believe when he issued his first tweet about the event and then had to correct it, adding the word landscaping a few minutes later. The owner of Four Seasons Total Landscaping appeared equally mystified. We don't really know how it happened, the owner's son said a week later. We heard it might have been a mistake or something. We just kind of picked up the phone and said yes and cleared some stuff out and managed to make it happen. The landscaping company capitalized on its newfound notoriety, offering Make America Rake Again and Lawn and Order t-shirts for sale by the next week. Watching news coverage of the event, my first thought was, is this a joke? It quickly became clear that it was not. Here was Rudy Giuliani, the lawyer for the President of the United States, standing in a strip mall parking lot making wild and false claims of election fraud. Giuliani had led New York City as our nation recovered from the attacks of 9/11. I had visited the remains of the World Trade Towers with him in the weeks after the attack. Now, as I watched the press conference, I kept thinking how far Rudy Giuliani had fallen. How had we gotten to a point that a spectacle like this was being held on behalf of the President of the United States? Though they weren't saying so publicly at the time, the leadership of the Trump campaign had essentially the same reaction I did. To make matters worse for Donald Trump, the networks called the presidential race for Joe Biden just as Giuliani's Four Seasons press conference was airing. Maybe now, I thought, Trump will concede. Instead, 2 days later, Trump announced personnel changes at the Pentagon that were unprecedented for a lame duck president and added to growing concerns about just what he might be planning. On November 9th, Trump fired his Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. I'd known Mark for many years. We first worked together in 2008 when Tennessee Senator Fred Thompson ran for president, and Mark and I were foreign policy advisors to his campaign. I respected Mark, and I knew he was trying to do the right thing in a very tough set of circumstances. I was serving on the House Armed Services Committee at the time, charged with overseeing the Department of Defense, or DoD. Esper's firing was deeply disquieting. The period of transition from one administration to the next is a time of heightened potential vulnerability for the United States. What happens at the Pentagon is especially important. Ensuring stability and a smooth transition is crucial. No lame duck president focused on securing the nation would replace his top civilian leaders at DoD days after losing an election. Yet that's what Trump was doing. Eric Edelman, a tremendously skilled and effective career ambassador who had served presidents of both parties at the highest levels of government, including in the White House, the State Department, and as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, described it to me this way. This is getting very serious, very dangerous, and very worrisome, even for folks who are disposed to remain calm. Esper believed he had been fired in part because he had made clear he would not stand for any use of the military to contest the outcome of an election. Trump's appointment of Chris Miller to replace Esper was a further troubling sign. Despite a lengthy career in special operations, Miller lacked any expertise or relevant background in dealing with what had become our nation's greatest challenge, the threat from great power competitors China and Russia. He had no familiarity with the huge array of policy challenges facing the Defense Department, its acquisition process, or its sprawling bureaucracy. Although Chris Miller had briefly been placed in charge of the National Counterterrorism Center, he had never managed anything close to the scale of DoD. He was quite possibly the least qualified nominee to become Secretary of Defense since the position was created in 1947. At the same time, Trump moved to install other loyalists in what seemed an effort to ensure the inexperienced Miller could be guided and his decisions shaped to suit Trump's whims. Kash Patel was appointed on November 10th to serve as Chris Miller's chief of staff. As far as I knew, Patel had no military experience. He had never served in any capacity at the Department of Defense. But Patel was a Donald Trump loyalist. The president had reportedly attempted to appoint Patel to several other positions throughout the government, including as deputy CIA director and deputy FBI director, only to meet strong resistance, including threats of resignation, from the agency professionals who would have had to work with Patel. Douglas Macgregor, a retired colonel who regularly spreads pro-Putin propaganda on American airwaves, was named senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Trump had nominated Macgregor to be U.S. ambassador to Germany a few months earlier, but Macgregor failed to win confirmation. Now he was installed in the upper echelons of the Pentagon. Trump also named retired Brigadier General Anthony Tata to be acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Tata was yet another Trump nominee unable to win Senate confirmation. In this case, Trump was appointing him to the very position for which the Senate had refused to confirm him just a few months earlier. Taken together, these appointments were deeply troubling. Trump had lost the election. Why was he appointing inexperienced loyalists to the most senior civilian positions in the Pentagon at a moment when stability was key? Why was he making these moves if he intended to begin an orderly and peaceful presidential transition to Joe Biden? It was an ominous sign of things to come. 2. Put up or shut up. House Republicans were scheduled to meet again on November 17, 2020, to elect our leadership team for the 117th Congress. There were rumors that the Freedom Caucus, a group of Republican members of the House who had become very pro-Trump, were considering nominating candidates to run against Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise, or me for one of the top leadership posts. Early in my first term, Jim Jordan, who was then chair of the Freedom Caucus, had tried to get me to join the group. Sitting down in an empty seat beside me at one of my first House Republican meetings, Jordan asked if I would consider becoming a Freedom Caucus member. Cynthia Lummis, my predecessor as Wyoming's Congresswoman, had been a member, but I had told Wyoming voters that I did not intend to join. I wasn't comfortable with a number of things about the group, including their rule requiring every member of the caucus to support any position that was held by 80% of their membership. It didn't seem right to me for a member of Congress to agree to have their vote bound by anything other than their obligations to their constituents and to the Constitution. Jordan did make a memorable pitch to me to join the group, though. It went something like this: "Would you consider joining the Freedom Caucus? We don't have any women, and we need one." Tempting as this offer was, I took a pass. My voting record was more conservative than those of many members of the Freedom Caucus, a supposedly conservative group. But a number of its members were hypersensitive to any criticism I made of Donald Trump. They had been grumbling about my public opposition to things such as Trump's September 2020 suggestion that we could postpone the presidential election. They were angry when I challenged Trump's refusal that same month to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. And they seemed especially upset when I tweeted a picture of my dad wearing a mask in June of 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, along with the caption, "Real men wear masks." As it turned out, nothing came of their threats to challenge our leadership team. Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise, and I were each re-elected to our positions without opposition. Later that same night, Donald Trump fired Chris Krebs, director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. Appointed by Trump himself, Krebs had spent 2 years working to harden America's election systems from outside interference. In the aftermath of the election, Krebs repeatedly countered Trump's false stolen election claims. On November 12th, Krebs had issued a joint statement with other state and federal election officials explaining that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history, and that there is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. Trump fired Krebs via tweet, just as he had fired Defense Secretary Esper a week earlier. Trump claimed without any evidence that there were massive improprieties and fraud, and that glitches in machines had switched millions of votes from Trump to Biden. Krebs did not go silently. After his dismissal, he confirmed repeatedly and publicly what federal and state election experts had concluded. In response, Joseph DeGeneva, one of Donald Trump's lawyers, raged in an interview that Chris Krebs should be, quote, drawn and quartered and taken out and shot at dawn. The Republican National Committee headquarters occupies prestigious real estate on Capitol Hill, half a block from the Cannon House office building and next door to the Capitol Hill Club. On Thursday, November 19th, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, Joseph DeGeneva, Victoria Tensing, and Boris Epstein, a group of lawyers representing Trump, held a press conference in the headquarters building to lay out yet more false claims of massive voter fraud. Chris Krebs called the event, quote, the most dangerous 1 hour and 45 minutes of television in American history. Giuliani opened the press conference by explaining that his assembled group was representing President Trump, and we're representing the Trump campaign, he said. There were many lawyers working on this, but, quote, we're the senior lawyers. Giuliani promised that he, Powell, and Ellis were about to present evidence we've collected over the last 2 weeks. He did not do that. Instead, Giuliani proceeded to make sweeping claims that Trump had won Wisconsin, quote, by a good margin, that he had carried Pennsylvania by, quote, 300,000 votes, and that there had been, quote, overvotes in numerous precincts of 150%, 200%, and 300% in certain Michigan and Wisconsin counties. Giuliani proclaimed that 682,770 ballots cast in Pennsylvania were null and void. In some precincts, he alleged, the number of votes cast was more than double the total population of those precincts. As Rudy's litany of lies continued under the glare of the camera lights, he began to sweat. Pulling a handkerchief from his pocket, he repeatedly wiped his face as he claimed that there was evidence of massive fraud, and that the election had therefore been, quote, irredeemably compromised. As Giuliani turned to point to a map of the United States on an easel beside the podium, brown rivulets of what seemed to be hair dye streamed down the side of his face. He kept going. In the states that we have indicated in red, he contended, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Arizona, we more than double the number of votes needed to overturn the election in terms of provable illegal ballots. His so-called evidence for this massive fraud consisted of 10 affidavits. He couldn't produce more, he said, because people feared going public, but he claimed the campaign had 1,000 at least. Rudy failed to explain how even 1,000 affidavits would be adequate to justify throwing out the votes of tens of millions of Americans. Instead, he insisted he had additional secret evidence, quote, aspects of this fraud that at this point I really can't reveal. Transfixed by the hair dye dripping down his face, it was challenging to focus on what Rudy was saying. But as he introduced Sidney Powell, he made this attention-grabbing pronouncement. I don't think most Americans know that our ballots get calculated, many of them, outside the United States. And it's being done by a company that specializes in voter fraud. According to Giuliani, America had used, quote, largely a Venezuelan voting machine, in essence, to count our vote. And if we let this happen, we are going to become Venezuela. What is he talking about, I thought. Was Sidney Powell going to provide evidence for this claim? Powell stepped up to the microphone and explained that America's entire election system had essentially been hacked by Dominion voting machines and Smartmatic technology software, which she said was software created in Venezuela at the direction of Hugo Chavez. She described an algorithm that she said had switched votes from Trump to Biden and that had, quote, trashed Trump votes. According to Powell, we learned about this only because Donald Trump got so many votes, the whole system broke. But we needed to be aware, she warned, that this same sinister source code resided in voting machines all across the country. Her evidence for these assertions? One very strong witness who has explained how it all works. This witness's affidavit, she said, was attached to pleadings that lawyer Lynn Wood had filed in a lawsuit in Georgia. Then, her voice breaking with emotion, Powell said this was all, quote, stunning, heartbreaking, infuriating, and the most unpatriotic acts I can even imagine for people in this country to have participated in. She claimed that, quote, President Trump won by a landslide. We are going to prove it, and we are going to reclaim the United States of America for the people who vote for freedom, end quote. Immediately following Powell's remarks, Jenna Ellis stepped up to the podium to say that the assembled lawyers were an elite strike force team that is working on behalf of the president and the campaign. Rudy reiterated that he and Sidney were, quote, in charge of this investigation. The whole performance was too bizarre for words. My daughter Elizabeth, who had been following the litigation closely and was increasingly disgusted with what Trump's lawyers were doing, texted me that night. Mom, I think it's safe to say that Rudy Giuliani's hair dye dripping down his face today was an act of God. It quickly became apparent, even to hardcore Trump supporters such as Tucker Carlson, that Sidney Powell had no evidence to back up her claims. 3 days after the press conference, Ellis and Giuliani issued a statement saying that Sidney Powell was, quote, not a member of the Trump legal team. She is also not a lawyer for the president in his personal capacity. Rush Limbaugh, a steadfast Trump supporter, said of the press conference, they promised blockbuster stuff and then nothing happened. Ultimately, all three of the lawyers who spoke at the press conference, Giuliani, Powell, and Ellis, would be sanctioned by courts, censured, or have their license to practice law suspended. And each would be indicted because of their lies about the election. Sidney Powell responded to a defamation lawsuit against her by arguing that, quote, no reasonable person would conclude that the statements were truly statements of fact. Jenna Ellis admitted that she had engaged in professional misconduct by spreading falsehoods about the 2020 election, and she was censured. And a court in New York reached this conclusion about Rudy Giuliani. Quote, he communicated demonstrably false and misleading statements to the courts, lawmakers, and the public at large in his capacity as lawyer for former President Donald J. Trump and the Trump campaign, in connection with Trump's failed effort at re-election in 2020. But the damage had already been done. Millions of Americans, including tens of thousands of my own constituents, believed these lies, and they believed in the people telling them. One constituent called the performance clear-eyed and determined. This person said that Powell struck her as forthright and noted that the Trump lawyer had been, quote, shaking with righteous anger and very persuasive. Then she added, of course the talking heads will dismiss them. F them. We were in dangerous territory. The president and his legal team were making outlandish and false claims that struck at the heart of our electoral process. Millions of Americans believed them, and the Trump campaign continued to send emails and run ads spreading these same falsehoods all over the country. Donald Trump was doing it nearly every time he spoke publicly. I knew how perilous this was. I knew it had to stop. The next day, November 20th, I issued a statement calling on President Trump to put up or shut up. America is governed by the rule of law. The president and his lawyers have made claims of criminality and widespread fraud, which they allege could impact election results. If they have genuine evidence of this, they are obligated to present it immediately in court and to the American people. I understand that the president has filed more than 30 separate lawsuits. If he's unsatisfied with the results in those lawsuits, then the appropriate avenue is to appeal. If the president cannot prove these claims or demonstrate that they would change the election result, he should fulfill his duty to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States by respecting the sanctity of our electoral process. I did not know it at the time, but the lawyers in the Trump campaign and at the Trump White House agreed with me. Despite that, the intense public reaction to my statement was a sign of things to come. I heard from many constituents that they believed I was, quote, going after Trump, and that I was betraying Wyoming. Emotions were running high. Some of the anger stemmed from desperation about the damage Biden policies might do to our state. Our biggest industries, fossil fuels and ranching, are profoundly impacted by policies set in Washington, D.C. The federal government owns nearly 50% of the land in Wyoming, as well as 2/3 of the state's subsurface minerals. Whether the issue was grazing cattle on public lands, securing permits for oil and gas leasing, or sustaining our coal industry, there was a widespread sense that a Biden administration would impose policies that would ruin people's lives. If the Democrats had truly stolen the election, as Trump and his representatives alleged, no one in Wyoming would take that lying down. The Republican National Committee's own lawyer, Justin Reamer, also sounded the alarm about the lies being told by the president's lawyers. In a message to Trump spokesperson Elizabeth Harrington on November 28th, Reamer said, "What Rudy and Jenna are doing is a joke, and they are getting laughed out of court. They are misleading millions of people who have wishful thinking that the president is going to somehow win this thing." Reamer was right. Ultimately, the January 6th investigation found dozens of people in the White House, the Trump campaign, and throughout the Trump administration who agreed with what Reamer said. A few days after I issued my 20th statement calling on Trump to produce evidence of fraud and respect the sanctity of our elections, my chief of staff, Kara Ahern, got a call from a staffer in the White House. He informed her that I was off the guest list for the White House congressional holiday party. Invites to these parties are highly coveted by most members of Congress, but I hadn't gone during any of the previous years I'd been in Congress, and I hadn't planned to attend this one. I was amused that whoever gave the instruction to disinvite me thought that I would view it as a punishment. When news of my blacklisting broke in Politico, I got a wonderful text from my colleague Ken Buck, a congressman from Colorado who was a former prosecutor and had worked as a staffer for my father on the Iran-Contra Committee in the 1980s. Ken told me he was having Christmas ornaments specially made that year, bearing this Ronald Reagan quote. "To a few of us here today, this is a solemn and most momentous occasion. And yet, in the history of our nation, it is a commonplace occurrence. The orderly transfer of authority, as called for in the Constitution, routinely takes place as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle. I wasn't the only one who recognized how dangerous this moment was becoming, but the truth was not breaking through. Far too many people were hearing only Donald Trump's lies. I was spending hours on the phone and in person talking to constituents about what was really happening. Conspiracy theories were everywhere, and they stretched beyond what was happening in the election. One afternoon, I called 2 constituents who had long been supporters of mine. They lived in different parts of Wyoming, and they didn't really know each other, but they had obviously been reading the same dangerous garbage online. They both began their separate calls with me, asking whether I was aware that the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court was operating a child sex trafficking ring in his basement. Of course, that's not true, I told each of them. But how could I be sure it wasn't true? They each wanted to know. I was dumbfounded. These were 2 relatively reasonable individuals, not people I would have guessed would be susceptible to crackpot claims like this. So ludicrous was the accusation that I wasn't sure where to begin to knock it down. It was becoming clear that the truth no longer really mattered. When House Republicans convened by phone on December 1st, 2020, Texas Representative Louis Gohmert, himself a purveyor of crackpot claims, got in the queue to speak. He had a message for me. I want you to know, he said, that had I seen your statement attacking Trump, I never would have supported your reelection to leadership. I would have recruited someone to run against you. Sometimes it was best to let members vent in these calls or meetings with the entire Republican conference. We did not respond to every complaint or criticism, but I decided not to let this attack stand. Which part of the statement do you have a problem with, Louis? I asked. Surely you don't disagree with the part that says America is governed by the rule of law, or the part that says claims of widespread criminality must be backed up by evidence, or the part that says the president is obligated to respect the sanctity of our election process. As it turned out, Louis's commitment to those concepts was not exactly rock solid. A few weeks later, he sued Vice President Pence, urging a federal court to rule that Pence could refuse to count certain states' electoral votes when he presided over Congress's upcoming joint session on January 6th. When his lawsuit was dismissed, Gohmert claimed that the only option left was to take to the streets and get violent. Gohmert later said that he hadn't actually been calling for violence, but there was no question that he had been spreading the worst lies and then implying that all the institutions of American democracy had failed. Gohmert was suggesting to people that their country was being stolen from them and that there was only one way to save it. 3. Someone is going to get killed. In the United States, our courts adjudicate claims of election fraud. Elections can't be overturned based merely on accusations or because someone says they believe there has been fraud. Sufficient evidence is required, and the fraud must have occurred on a scale that could change the result. That's the rule of law. If he had a basis, Donald Trump had the right to bring election challenges in court. What neither he nor any other candidate has the right to do is ignore the rulings of those courts. Donald Trump and his supporters were certainly trying to use the courts, filing more than 60 lawsuits. Throughout November and December, my husband Phil and I were watching the outcomes of those lawsuits in federal and state courts. Trump's losses in those cases began in the first half of November and continued over the following weeks. The results were the same almost everywhere, in state courts and in federal courts, including before federal judges appointed by Donald Trump himself. Never did any of Trump's allegations of fraud, including supposed fraud by Dominion voting systems, by Smartmatic, or by any other voting machine or software company, prove to be true. None of it was backed up by evidence. Dozens of courts reviewed the Trump allegations, and dozens of courts rejected them. In a Nevada court, for example, The Trump legal team had a full opportunity to call witnesses and put on its case. At the time, Kayleigh McEnany, speaking for the campaign, celebrated that particular case as, quote, the most important case, and an opportunity for Trump to prove that the election had been stolen from him. Yet, despite the stacks of paper McEnany waved around on Sean Hannity's show, Trump and his team did not have any real evidence. They lost in the Nevada trial court, and they lost again in the Nevada Supreme Court. Ultimately, Trump and his allies lost 60 out of 61 cases. Their only victory, in Pennsylvania, involved an insufficient number of votes to impact the outcome of that state's election. By December 1st, Donald Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr had had enough of what he later called bullshit election claims. Barr told the Associated Press that the Department of Justice had been investigating the allegations of fraud and, quote, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. This made Trump so angry that he reportedly threw his lunch at a wall in the White House. Undeterred, the next day, Trump posted a 45-minute speech to Facebook, repeating his false claims of election fraud. Across the country in early December, state election officials were facing increasing pressure as a result of Trump's continued false claims as they prepared to certify the results. In Georgia, on December 1st, election official Gabe Sterling held an extraordinary press conference in which he pleaded with the president personally to stop inciting threats and violence. Quote, stop inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence. Someone is going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed, and it's not right. A Georgia reporter tweeted out video of Sterling's plea and warning. At 10:27 p.m. that night, Trump responded. He didn't condemn the threats of violence. He didn't call for a stop to them. He doubled down. Retweeting the video of Sterling's speech, Trump repeated the very lies that Sterling had warned about. Rigged election, show signatures in envelopes, expose the massive voter fraud. I already had some sense at the time that Trump was pressuring state legislators. For example, he had invited Republican leaders of the Michigan State House and Senate to the White House in November. This visit caused enough alarm that upon leaving their meeting with Trump, these lawmakers issued a statement reaffirming that they would not overturn the results of the Michigan election by flipping their electoral votes to Trump from Biden. However, Gabe Sterling's stark and direct warning about the potential for violence alerted me that Trump was doing far more than I had initially recognized. As Sterling made clear, Trump and his team were provoking violent threats. The following week, the entire House Republican Conference was dragged into Trump's frivolous claims, this time in front of the United States Supreme Court. On Monday, December 7th, the state of Texas petitioned the Supreme Court, challenging the results of the presidential election in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. All 4 states won by Joe Biden. Although the Texas Solicitor General would normally represent the state before the Supreme Court, he was not listed on this brief, which was instead filed by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. A number of conservative Republicans raised public concerns about the constitutionality of the claims Paxton was making. Texas Senator John Cornyn, who had previously served both as the state's Attorney General and as a justice on its Supreme Court, said, I frankly struggle to understand the legal theory of it. Number one, why would a state, even such a great state as Texas, have a say-so on how other states administer their elections? We have a diffused and dispersed system, and even though we might not like it, they may think it's unfair. Those are decided at the state and local level, and not at the national level. Congressman Chip Roy, a Texas Republican and member of the House Freedom Caucus, said, quote, the case itself represents a dangerous violation of federalism. A conservative legal analyst and former federal prosecutor noted that, quote, every claim raised in Texas's complaint has already been rejected by other courts, in particular the Third Circuit Court of Appeals and the Federal District Court in Pennsylvania. Noting that the Texas Solicitor General had not signed the brief, this analyst pointed out that the lawsuit is so frivolous and so blatantly political that the top appellate lawyers in his office evidently declined to endorse it. The attorneys general for each of the states targeted by Texas, including Georgia's attorney general, who was also chair of the Republican Attorneys General Association, explained that the claims in the Texas brief were false, and that, in fact, each state had conducted its election in the manner determined by its state legislature. A spokesman for Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr